Hello, and welcome to the National Museum of the Pacific War's webinar series. My name is Jacqueline Mertz. I am the Museum Programs Coordinator, and I will be your host for today. For today's webinar, we have Mr. David Krigbaum with us, and he will be sharing his travels around Japan, visiting some of its most interesting surviving war-related sites. And so now I am so honored to introduce our presenter, Mr. David Krigbaum. He is a professional writer and photographer based out of Okinawa, Japan. He runs Wayfarer Dave's Travel and History, a website primarily about using travel as an opportunity to learn and better understand history. Mr. Krigbaum, thank you for being here with us today. The floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. I'm David, coming at you live from Okinawa. This morning, we're going to explore Japan's World War II related battlefields, ruins, and military sites. Along the way, I'll share their histories and my travel stories, as well as talk a bit about how I found them and how you can find World War II sites for yourself. I hope you can see these places yourself once the current unpleasantness is over. Now, before living in Japan, I was stationed in Italy, where I traveled Europe seeing museums and places associated with both world wars. So when I moved to Japan in 2015, I didn't expect to find many war ruins or related museums. We're now going to spend 45 minutes, or as long as you can tolerate my voice, looking over how impressively wrong I was when I moved to Sasebo, Nagasaki Prefecture. Sasebo is what they called a Shinjuku, or naval district. The town in Nagasaki, which is in southwest Japan, is one of the four Shinjuku of the Imperial Japanese Navy: Sasebo, Kure, Yokosuka, and Maizuru. These are places equal in importance to, say, San Diego or Norfolk to the U.S. Navy. They are places where they would home port ships, they would build ships, they would support the fleet, they would train sailors. These were very important to the Navy, which meant there's a lot of Navy-related sites all around town. And there still are to this day. So if it is fairly easy to find World War II related sites in Sasebo. In fact, due to the Four Naval Ports campaign, they are actively trying to get people to go out and visit their military heritage sites. So they have a lot of well-preserved and varied sites to go see. We're going to start out with one of my favorites, the Triumphal Return Memorial Hall, or the Gaisen Kenninkan. This was built in 1923 as a assembly hall for the Imperial Japanese Navy. Now, it was built to commemorate, as the title says, Triumphal Return, the participation of Japan in World War I. A lesser known fact of World War I is that the Japanese were allies of the British, and so they actually declared war on Germany very shortly after Britain did in 1914. And they ended up sending a squadron of destroyers to the Mediterranean to protect Allied shipping. Now, this was originally, as I said, an assembly hall. And after the war, it was taken over by the U.S. military and spent the next couple of decades as a movie theater. And then after that, it was returned to Sasebo City and turned into a big event space, where you would see performances, musical acts, presentations, and even weddings. I and my wife were actually married in this building a few years ago. We were the second ever couple to be married there by the city of Sasebo. So it has great personal meaning to me. Plus, if you look at it, it is in beautiful shape. And that's partially the key to, I think, its survival. So generally speaking, when it comes to these old war-related buildings, or military-related buildings, is either they have a use and they're kept in that use, they're repurposed, or they're knocked down. For example, across the street from this was the old admin building, which also used by the U.S. military. They turned it into a store and a high school, and eventually it got turned over to the city and flattened, and now there's a parking structure there and a sign telling you all about the building that used to be there. And across the street from this is Officers Club that is now a museum. So I think that's three good examples of those that idea that it's one of those three things, at least in an area that is prime real estate like downtown. The other Sasebo site I want to share with you is the Hario Wireless Transmitting Station. This was built in 1922 and today is a cultural asset due to its industrial value. This may not look like much. It looks like a set of smokestacks, but at one point, these were some of the most modern and powerful radio transmitters in Japan. And they're best known for a message they are believed to have sent in 1941. Nitakayama Nobore, climb Mount Nitaka. They're believed to have relayed the attack order for Pearl Harbor from the battleship in Tokyo Bay to Hario to Formosa to the fleet itself, though they were used throughout the war, and they were in the site was in service with with the Japanese Coast Guard until 1997, and now it is a public ruin. You can see here, this is the inside of one of the towers. The actual radio equipment is all gone. The towers themselves are just, they're shells, they're skeletons. But it is a fascinating piece of radio history if you're into such things, as well as, of course, military history. Now, as you can tell, though, it's in the middle of nowhere. So if you want to visit it, you need a car. But because it is something Sasebo wants people to go see, finding it is not difficult, and you can take tours to get out there. Now, this is the control room. It's a bit overgrown. When I first visited Sasebo, when I first moved there, it was off limits. Now they put out hard hats and you can visit your own risk. And I love places like that. Moving on down the road from Sasebo, another set of ruins that stand out are the former Hiroshima Torpedo Testing Facility in Kawatana. As I mentioned, I'm married. My wife's hometown is Kawatana. It's a small town on Omura Bay between Sasebo and the city of Omura. And it got its start with the Navy in 1918. Originally, the Imperial Japanese Navy did torpedo testing in Sasebo Bay. This is the same bay that they did their ships. As you can probably imagine, torpedo testing in a busy bay is not the greatest of places to do so. So they moved down the road to Kawatana, which is a much more less heavily trafficked area, let's put it that way. And so Hiroshima was built in 1918, and it was updated in 1939, 1942. They built some small torpedo factories. They made some improvements. If you look at this image here, I'm standing out on the pier where they would launch torpedoes from. Now, the building kind of off to the right there used to be two of them. These towers flanked a torpedo launching point where the torpedoes would be practice shot out into the water. And I was told that originally they would have boats at set intervals and they would be timed. There'd be someone out in the boats timing it until 1942, when you see that little tiny building way off in the distance, that is sonar. They put that up and they could then use sonar to track the movement of torpedoes. And the building, you see the big building on the left, well, that was the old machine shop, which was later on updated. They made a second floor to it and turned it into a torpedo adjustment room and air compressor. So what's neat about this place is just how much is left. This is just a forested ruin that has it was kind of taken over by the forest when I first visited, but like with Sasebo, they've made efforts recently to really preserve and share their naval history. So the city has cut back all the heavy foliage so you can safely walk, but at the same time, they didn't disturb the ruins. They didn't change the ruins. And you don't really see torpedo testing site ruins that often. So it's kind of a unique place to go out and visit. The Kawatana is not hard to get to. Well, you get on the train from, say, Sasebo to Kawatana, or you drive there. The site itself is a little bit far from the station. So if you do visit Japan, this is somewhere you would probably want to get a car to go see. but it is definitely worth seeing in my opinion. Otherwise, I wouldn't have brought it up here. Now, let me get a little bit closer in. This is land side. You can see the large building I was talking about earlier. To the left is a water tank, and to the right are is the foundation of Torpedo Factory number 2. And let's say I have them flipped around. Beyond the little flat area is where the other factory was. One was built in 39, one was built in 1942. Now, this was not the main torpedo building factory in the area. In 1943, a nice big torpedo factory was built. They produced Type 91 aerial torpedoes. And I learned a little bit about this by visiting my wife's family. So you see this right here is what you call an evacuation factory. There are some buildings left over from the old torpedo factory, the Kawatana Naval Factory, as it was called. But they're kind of mixed into a residential neighborhood. They don't really stand out anymore other than just kind of funny looking old buildings. This, though, I think is kind of neat. So they look like air raid shelters. But when I first visited them, I saw the sign said that it's actually an evacuation factory, which meant that they would build these tunnels and they would fill them with equipment from the factory so that if the factory was bombed, the Navy could keep producing torpedoes. It's a slower rate than if you were using the full-size factory, but it's still a faster rate than if your equipment is a smoldering hole in the ground. And so we visited this place, and then I met my wife's grandmother for the first time. And I told Bachan through my wife about visiting these tunnels, and I'd commented that they were dark, and then she'd said, "Oh yes," and they were hot and humid to work in too. She helped build the tunnels. She was a teenage typist working at the factory, and apparently she built torpedoes as well as being a typist, and she also made camouflage for these tunnels. And so we learned a little bit about her that day that even my wife didn't know. And all this in her little hometown of, I think, 15,000 people. These days, these ruins, you can tell they're still here. They're not accessible. And unlike the torpedo factory or torpedo testing site ruins, which you can walk around freely in its entirety. The other thing in Kawatana worth knowing about is the Arashibhutai. This was a school for motorboats run by Captain Hara Tamaichi, the man who wrote Japanese Destroyer Captain. They were also a school for teaching waterborne kamikazes. So besides the more famous airborne kamikazes, the Navy had a number of seaborne kamikazes. You had the Kaiten manned torpedoes and the Shinyo motorboats, which were loaded with explosives. And you had Fukuryu frogmen. The latter two were trained at this school. So the only thing left of that school, though, is this stump in the water, and there's a memorial to the Shinyo pilots. Every year at the torpedo testing site ruins, they have a taketoro, that's a bamboo lantern festival, where they commemorate the dead. You'll see a lot of that. It's not really they don't celebrate war in Japan. They don't celebrate the fighting, but they do believe in honoring the dead, which I think is an important thing to do. And as for as I mentioned, the Shinyo were the motorboats, the Fukuryu were frogmen. So they wore the big diving suits, and these guys carried lunge mines. That's a bombing of a pole. And the idea was that when an American landing craft would approach an invasion beast, they, standing at the bottom of the bay, would lunge up with that bomb and blow up the landing craft. The irony is that the men who volunteered to die, for the most part, lived. The men who went to the conventional school, the non-suicide school, many went to the Philippines and Okinawa and were killed in action, whereas the Fukuryu were held back for the defense of Japan because that battle never came. Except for those that died in training, they all survived to see the end of the war. Now, as I mentioned, those kamikazes, for the airborne kamikazes, there are multiple kamikaze sites and museums, especially on Kyushu. So there's 4 kamikaze museums, Tachiarai, Chiran, and Bonsai, throughout the island of Kyushu. And each one is different. So for the most part, there's not much in the way of ruins if you're interested in seeing ruins on those places, but they have a museum with a lot of artifacts and some interesting airplanes. Each one has a unique airplane or two to go see. Tachiarai is in the middle of Fukuoka Prefecture. It's kind of in the middle of nowhere. And what's interesting about it is that it used to be one of the biggest airports in Japan. Of course, I'd never even heard of this place. It's way out in Fukuoka near none of the big cities. But this used to be very important. It was a large army aviation school, and then during the war, it was used as a kamikaze school as well, or excuse me, a school, but it was used as a kamikaze base as well. And it possesses 2 unique aircraft: the Model 32 Zero fighter, that's the one with the square wingtips, the only one in the world, and a Ki-27 fighter right here, which I had to get special permission to take pictures of. Again, it's the only one left in the world. This one went down in Hakata Bay and was fished out of the bay decades later. And so for that reason, it's now on display. After I took this picture, a staff member took me over to the memorial room, and he had pointed out the memorial room has the pictures of everyone who died in air raids in this city. A lot of people, including about a dozen Americans. It was a B-29 crew. And so the B-29 crew was there because, as they said, they died here too. And so they wanted to remember everyone who died, including their own enemies, the people who had just bombed Omura and crashed here. Or excuse me, they didn't bomb Omura in that mission, but they had crashed after a bombing. And so I found that rather touching. It was interesting in this museum because I saw for the first time a piece of B-29 wreckage on display as an enemy aircraft. And when you're walking around the museum, there's kind of this weird, like you get this weird sense of something looming over you. And when you look up, you see the life-size silhouette of a B-29, which was it's a unique touch of theirs. I haven't seen any other museum to kind of give you that feeling of a little bit of dread as something is over you while you're reading about these bombings. And I think it kind of helps get you into the mindset for thinking about these things and how people felt. But that said, like I said, they even remembered the Americans who died in this town. Likewise, it's not common, but I've seen B-29 memorials where they remember people who crashed. And for one place in particular, when I first moved to Japan, one of my first photo jobs was covering a memorial service for a B-29 rammed by a Zero. They went to a memorial for both the crew of both aircraft, the U.S. Navy, the JMSDF, and a local association, which is putting the whole thing together, which again, I found very touching that they would want to do that. Chiran is the more famous kamikaze museum in Kagoshima Prefecture. This is the kind of the big one. This is the one that it's all about the Army's kamikaze program. They have a lot of personal information on the pilots. They have a lot of the photos. They have the last letters home, artifacts. They talk about Chiran, the base, and how it came to being. And if you're wondering about how do they present these places, they always present on the general idea is the prayer for peace and to commemorate the dead, no more, no less. Well, maybe a little bit more. But the idea is that you want to remember those who died and you don't want this to ever happen again. And after visiting this museum, my wife and I were driving home in a very quiet car ride, very somber. And she says out of the blue, "I really hate Tojo." I was rather surprised that that's what that was her feeling, was that I really hate Tojo for starting this war. And so I think that's kind of indicative of what they or how they try to share their story and convey the idea of peace and the desire to not have or start wars. If you go here, it's a pretty, it can be pretty rough. This is all bilingual, and so you read these stories, these last letters home from young men before they went out and died. So I highly recommend this one. I recommend all of these. And if you're in the area for this, if you can drive another 45 minutes, Bonsai is another smaller kamikaze related museum. Similar, but much smaller. Chiron was the biggest, launched the most kamikaze missions, the army bases. Bonsai was a much smaller one. Now, Kanoya is a Navy kamikaze museum. Well, the Kanoya base is still an active JMSDF base, so they do use the old runways. There's still the fighter protection still. I suddenly forgot the word for it, but all that's on base. You can't go out and see it. But there is this museum with a nice collection of airplanes. Most are post-war, except for this big old Emily flying boat. And so how I found this place and a lot of these other places was I was looking for airplanes and I stumbled across them. Now, the Emily here, I learned about back around 2005, 2006. I was helping an F14 Tomcat pilot with his retirement, and he had mentioned there used to be this big flying boat at Norfolk, or I think it was Norfolk, that we'd given back to the Japanese, and but that was interesting. I want to go see this. So I had to track this thing down, find where it went to, find where it moved to, and finally find out it's in Kanoya, take a bullet train to get to Kagoshima, to take a bus to get to here and see this impressive aircraft, because yes, I will travel halfway across an island just to see an airplane. Some of us are just built different, I guess. So this is I thought was the coolest thing about this place, but they also have a whole section on their kamikaze operations and a Zero fighter. So this, unlike the other museums, is free, and that is something worth considering. So if you're going out the Kagoshima way, you can see Chiron, Bonsai, and this museum here as well. Now, if you're in the mood for actual ruins of an airfield, we have USA in northeastern Kyushu. All these bases I just talked about are on Kyushu. USA is a former Navy airfield. It's where they train the dive bomber pilots. They have a small museum there explaining that they taught the pilots who bombed Pearl Harbor. This was the primary one of the primary dive bomber schools for the Imperial Japanese Naval Air Service. And so later in the war, they were also used to launch kamikaze missions, which brought retaliatory strikes to the US, put them out of action. And so they were heavily bombed throughout the war, but it was never fully put out of decommission, I believe, until nearly the end. And so when I first visited here, all I knew was that there were these hardened shelters right here. Now, this is a one aircraft hardened shelter doing its best to imitate a hill. You know, great camouflage in a flat field is the giant mystery lumps covered in grass, pretending to be not aircraft shelters next to the runways or near the runways. I think they're convincing. Well, I knew about these, and I knew about the little visitor center. So we drove out there on a trip once. We get to the visitor center and, oh, there's a map. This whole town is full of ruins everywhere. Oh, it's now a scavenger hunt day. My wife is a very long-suffering woman. We spent the rest of the day running around town trying to find the different ruins hidden among the city, because the city grew over the airfield, and in many cases, the buildings are reused. This is a test cell for engines. This is in a residential neighborhood, hidden behind a tree line. So we were driving around looking for this, and we stopped and asked an old lady, hey, do you know where this building is? And she says, oh, it's right over there. Do you want to go visit it? I own it. So she gave us the tour and she explained that her family moved into this building in 1945. They bought the building. She was very quick to point out they were not squatters. They purchased this building and she grew up there. This was her family home until the 1960s. This is where she lived. This is where her family lived. They lived in this control room and they built a kitchen in the hallway. They then rented out the second control room and made it kind of a duplex. I can only imagine what this looked like when it was a residence. Now it's kind of a shell. If you're get to USA, please make time to go around. There is just a lot to go see. And as of those hardened shelters I showed you before, this one's preserved. The rest of them are tractor sheds and barns for farmers. And so you drive around and you see these things and they're all full of farming equipment. Okinoshima is an island in the Seto Inland Sea that was originally it had a set of coastal defense forts from the 1900s, and then they turned it into a poison gas factory. All the advertising for this, when you go out there, come to Bunny Island, see the cute bunnies, play with don't touch them, but admire the cute bunnies. Meanwhile, I'm like, there's the ruins of a poison gas factory. I want to see this. I mean, that's kind of an uncommon thing to see. This is the Nagaura storehouse. This is a hill cut open and filled with mustard gas containers. They primarily made mustard gas and lewisite, and the whole island is dotted with ruins from its days as a factory and as a fortress. Now, before I talk about redeveloping or reusing a building in a different way, after the U.S. military gave up control of this island, after the war, the U.S. took it over, destroyed the chemical stockpiles, and then after that, someone moved in and decided this would make a great getaway. They turned the laboratory into a hotel. Now there's a purpose-built hotel. And so you have this getaway hotel on an island covered with bunnies, full of military ruins. Now, to their credit, they have signage on all the ruins because they cover the whole island. This is one of the most complete sets of ruins I've ever seen. The equipment is gone, but all the concrete shells remain. So you can spend hours just walking around up and down, seeing everything from the forts and the poison gas factory. This is the Nagaura, by the way. This is the biggest. This was the biggest storehouse on the island. There are a few more, and they're all different from each other. This is one of the gun pits from the Gayo forts. Now, these forts were built to stock blueprints. So while each fort was different in its arrangement, all the pieces were paint by numbers. And so if you see one, you quite literally seen them all, more or less, except for Hiroshima. That's a different story. This is the biggest ruin on the island. This is the old power plant. You often see this one when people do stories on the poison gas factory. And this is the Poison Gas Museum. They pull no punches about how nasty poison gas is and its uses by the Japanese, and its effects on the workers here who had to, well, the workers here on the one hand, for them, you worked here, you were not getting drafted, and your pay was pretty good. On the downside, you will have long-term medical issues as safety, workplace safety was not quite perfected. I've seen a few interviews with people who worked here that talked about how after a couple of years working at this factory, you ended up with something because you were constantly exposed to the chemicals, and these suits, the protective suits like the one in the background, were not the best at protecting you. Now, an apology for this trauma, here is a fluffy bunny. So these bunnies are everywhere, and walking around the ruins, they creep me out. So imagine this, you're walking around poison gas factory ruins, and there's just these cute little bunnies just standing around, staring at you with their beady little bunny eyes, sometimes with mangled ears and missing eyes because they've been in bunny fight club. I mean, yeah, they look peaceful and cute, but when there's no people around, apparently they are fighting. And so I'll get to some ruins like on top of the island, and there's no reason for bunnies to be up here. There's no food, and yet there's some bunny just staring at me. It's like something out of a horror story. It's like, oh, did Dr. Moreau bring you to the island too? I had kind of a Dr. Moreau Jurassic Park vibe. I don't know why. One of the most Now, one of the most peculiar, that was probably the most peculiar conversion I've ever seen for a war ruin. Now, here's a different story for you. There's a place called Meijimura, which is one of my favorite places in Japan. It's an architectural park composed of Victorian and Edwardian buildings from all over Japan. That is the Meiji era, and as they call it, that were preserved by bringing them together into this little architectural park where they could be saved and people could go visit them. Two of the buildings here are from the former Nagoya garrison. This barracks here and a hospital, the garrison hospital. These two had a role in the Doolittle raid as they were targets, one intentional and one otherwise. So while Jimmy Doolittle had his 30 seconds over Tokyo, Major John Hilger had Nagoya. So during the Doolittle raid in 1942, Tokyo, Kanagawa, Kobe, Osaka, Yokosuka, Yokohama, and Nagoya were all struck. One of the Nagoya targets was the barracks at the Nagoya garrison near Nagoya Castle. Well, the barracks was attacked. They dropped a bomb over it. It sailed over the barracks and slammed into the garrison hospital. Luckily, there were no injuries from this. But after the war, both sets of buildings were taken over by another entity. In the 60s, they were being torn down. And so the barracks and the hospital, one of the barracks and one hospital ward and the admin building were preserved, not because of their military history or World War II history, but because they are both fine examples of 1870s military architecture in Japan. They're, I believe they're built to a French plan or built after a French pattern, and now they've been restored to their Russo-Japanese war configuration. That's the admin building right there. That's the ward. This one isn't mostly open. There's just one room with old medical equipment. And now let's move on to Hiroshima. So while most people go to Hiroshima to see the Genbaku Dome and the Peace Park, there's actually a lot more you can go see associated with the atomic bombing if you want to see more history where it happened. So Hiroshima recognizes 100 buildings as atomic bomb surviving structures. And so among them are a pair of schools, Fukuromachi and Hongkawa elementary schools. This is a view taken from the current Hongkawa Elementary School. This was 410 meters from the hypocenter, so still within half a kilometer of the hypocenter where the bomb went off. So Hongkawa is just across the river. They were a big L-shaped building, and so unfortunately, they lost almost their entire student body and staff after about 2 weeks. Only one student and one teacher remained alive. The student survived because she had been late to school and so was downstairs changing her shoes in the basement when the bomb went off. The schools continued to be used until the 1980s when it was torn down, but because it was so historic, you have to bear in mind the school was still in use. After the bombing, they put it back into service. They used it until the 80s, and so they had to still make use of the space. They couldn't just keep using old buildings. So they preserved this chunk of school over the basement part and tore down the rest of it. It's an active school, but you can still go visit it. You just have to go check in at the school office, tell them you want to see the museum, and they will take you right back to the museum. It's a free museum. I really recommend it as it's a personal story of World War II in a place where most people just go to see the big story. Fukuromachi is a very similar story. They had a few more survivors, but the same thing, except this school was torn down in the 1990s. It had to be replaced with a bigger school. You can kind of see the school over this little chunk of preserved building. Well, Fukuromachi had another piece of history to it after the bombing. So you see the wall there, looks like writing. This is a reproduction of the original, but after the atomic bombing, the school was used as an emergency first aid clinic. It was a aid station, and people would come there looking for people that they couldn't find, or they would be wounded, of course, and they'd pick up chalk off the ground and they would write messages on the walls. I am here. I was here. I am here now. Have you seen such and such? And so this was a brief moment in their history that was preserved under the walls. When the school went back into use and they white walled the walls over, these messages were preserved. So when the school was torn down, they knew that these messages were there, and so they made efforts to save the original wall messages. Now, as you imagine that, going to school somewhere in your classroom, right behind the wall are messages left over from people who just survived the world's first atomic bombing. Another piece of the bombing that you can still see here is the carbonized wood in the building itself, the blackened wood left over from the intense heat of the bomb. Again, this is a free museum. It's very close to the Peace Park. I highly recommend seeing this one if you have the time. Now I'm going to show you one of my favorite little spots in Hiroshima. This is in the Peace Park. This is kind of a unique view of the Genbaku Dome. This was also used in the television adaptation of In This Corner of the World. So it's like I saw it on TV. They put one of my favorite places in Hiroshima on TV. So if you're at the Peace Park across the street from the memorial, or the Genbaku Dome, look left. You're going to see some bushes and some trees towards Aoibashi. Walk down there, and you'll see stairs that cut down to the water. And those stairs have, as you can see in front of the Genbaku Dome, the stairs go down to the water because boats used to pull up there. The Peace Park was originally a place called Nakajima Honmachi. It was a neighborhood. This was a old part of town. And so you had these stairs that went to the water. People would come up and go from there. I think it was for delivery of goods. I may be mistaken. And so you can still go down those stairs, but again, that's original. That was there when the atomic bombing happened. And you get this unique view where you are alone. I mean, if you want to be contemplative, you can sit down here by yourself and think, with no one else around to bother you, and you get this unique angle of the Genbaku Dome. Now let's move on to Okinawa. And I have a couple minutes left, so I'll try to be brief. This is Hacksaw Ridge. Hacksaw Ridge is, we all see it from the movie. This is the actual ridge. It's much smaller than it looks in the film. This is on the grounds of Urasoe Castle Park. So it is preserved, I think, because it was on this already historic ground. And that's another neat thing with the battles. I didn't realize there was a castle ruin right there. Not much of a castle ruin. It was mostly destroyed, but I think before the battle it was mostly gone. But that was what used to be there. The white signs where the Japanese tunnels were, and they got grading something to keep out. This is the top of Hacksaw Ridge. It is not very big, as you can see. There's not a lot of fighting space up top. If you want to see a good bunker, I recommend seeing the Imperial Japanese Navy Underground Headquarters. This was built for the Battle of in preparation for the Battle of Okinawa in 1944 for use by the Navy. It's a very complete bunker that you can visit, though there's really nothing. It's not outfitted, but the halls are still there. This is Maboni Hill, where the battle ended. It is now next to the Peace Museum, which I recommend in southern Okinawa. Now, as you can tell, it's kind of been turned into a big park, so you don't really get a feel for the battlefield itself, if that's what you're after. It is a nice set of memorials, though. It's worth the time, especially after seeing the Peace Museum and learning about the battle and how it affected Okinawa. Finally, we have the Heyauri Museum. Heyauri were so that I'm mentioning this because I wrote about them last year. So during the Battle of Okinawa, the Japanese military they conscripted high school students from all 21 high schools and junior high schools in the prefecture to support them. The boys were used as auxiliaries. The girls were nursing aides or nursing assistants. Two of the schools, the Okinawa First Girls High School and the First Women's Normal School, the collectively heyauri, sent a couple hundred, I believe 220 off the top of my head, students, 240 including staff, to support the army. 136 died during the battle. And right here is their museum. I recommend it. It's a very hard story, but at the same time, it's to me, it's kind of a personal story of the battle. You see not the big picture of troop movements, but of a smaller group of people doing their part in the war. And it's not a very big museum, but it's completely bilingual, including the interviews with survivors, which you can spend an hour just listening to them talk about their experiences as, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19-year-old girls living through hell as this battle goes on around them. And in front of the memorial here is the third surgical cave. Third surgical cave was where a lot of them had died. There's actually a number of caves around the area. And so when I was researching heyauri, I found out these caves that they had served in were still there, as well as other groups. As I mentioned, they were only two of the schools. Other schools sent, obviously, other schools sent students as well. And so I went and saw caves associated with all of them with as many of them as I could as well. And in doing so, you kind of get a bigger feel for the battlefield, because southern Okinawa, Idomon, is still relatively undeveloped. So Naha is very paved over. People rebuilt after the war. The city expanded. So the battlefields of, like, say, Sugarloaf Hill, it's now in the middle of the city. You don't really get a feel for what the battlefield is like. Whereas here, it's still rolling hills. It's still farmland. It's still forest. And if you want to see one of the caves that hasn't really been touched, first surgical cave right here, which is 5 minutes by foot down the road from the heyauri Museum. It says on the map, first surgical trench, because they use the word trench interchangeably with the word bunker or cave. Finally, after seeing all those, caves, I recommend seeing the Arasaki Cliffs. It's a very beautiful place with a sad story. I'm sorry, there's a lot of sad stories with this, but they help you, I think, get a better understanding of history by seeing it where it happened. And that's why I travel, really, is to see history where it happened and try to better understand it that way. In this case, this was a location where a group of students, the heyauri, after being cut loose by the army, had fled to the southern cliffs, and a soldier jumped into their hole with them, or their cave, as they called it. And the Americans came in after them, firing. They hit a bunch of the heyauri as well as the soldier. Bear in mind, they were all half dressed in army uniforms, or dressed in some way, as I read in the account. If you look at their museum or read their biographies, they were issued army uniforms, and it looks like they wore the shirt with the monpe. So from the top, it looks like soldiers. And so in that rush, they fired upon them. And then, according to one of their accounts, they stopped as soon as they realized, the Americans realized they were shooting a bunch of girls. And so then one of the teachers used a grenade, as the girls had asked him to help just to commit suicide, just blow themselves up with these suicide grenades. He blew himself up with a bunch of the students. And you saw one student with a grenade and a bunch of survivors. And she wasn't sure what to do. Should she blow herself up with the grenade? Should she put it down? And one of the soldiers walked up to her and pulled the grenade out of her hands, and they began rendering first aid to the survivors. At this spot, where you see this memorial plaque on the far left on this hillside. So after seeing all the caves and the memorials in the area, I recommend just going out to going out to this place. It's a little bit hard to get to. I had to park a little way away on a dirt road and walk out to the cliffside. But yeah, definitely a place to go see if you want to see something. I don't think a lot of foreign tourists go out of their way to see, especially after learning about this kind of story. So I hope that I've been able to teach you all something, show you guys places you've not seen before. The locations here for the heyauri stories are on my website. So if you want to go visit the caves and the spots, that is on the site itself. I'm not trying to plug myself, but I did a lot of scavenger hunt work to find the locations and put them all in one place for you. And that's the reason a big part of the reason I made that was so that others can go make the most of their time in Japan, or at least take away the stories that they may not have otherwise heard. And in that way, the memory of the people that I learned about are spread and live on. Well, thank you. That concludes my slightly overlong talking. And I'm sorry if I skipped over some things. I kind of had to rush to the end. Do you have any questions for me?
So our first question is from Savannah. She asks, how do the Japanese people view these military sites? Are they tourist sites or are the visitors primarily foreign?
A lot of these places are actually more local memorial halls. Like they're entirely in Japanese, and they focus on one little part of the war as it relates to this community. And so like around Kyushu, like I mentioned, Tachiarai, there was only like part of it in English, part of it wasn't. Other places like Chiron or in Sasebo, where they are geared toward handling foreign tourists, that is a big one. They are prepared for it. Now, a big thing though is honestly, it's for school children. You'll see like with the Hiyauri Museum, their big thing, and right now they're struggling financially according to their website, because usually what you would have is like the Peace Museum in Hiyauri is they would have bus loads of school children coming through regularly and seeing these museums. With COVID right now, that seems to be cut off, and so that's making it harder for them to stay afloat. So it's a little bit off topic, but it does show you how important it is for them as educational facilities.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess, yeah, you have foreign tourism, like say Hiroshima is for everyone, I think. Again, that's any of those big sites, you've got a lot of school children that come through. And then, of course, you have the local memorials just to remember kind of what your ancestors did and what they lived through, so that memory isn't lost.
Okay. This question is from John. He's asking about the USA plane shelter pick, and he was wondering if you know the type of plane that was inside of that.
Okay, well I want to say it was I don't think it's really a Val. The only airplane in there, so that's kind of a trick. There is a propeller mounted on a stand. So I'm not sure what that propeller would have come from, if it would have came from a Val or if it would have come from something else. Because, I'm not an expert on propellers.
That's okay.
And they had several kinds of aircraft that were used. You have to bear in mind it was a training school. It was an advanced flight school. And towards the end, when they were using it as a kamikaze base, I'm not sure fully all the types of aircraft that were present.
Okay.
So sorry about that.
So just more of an illusion of a plane in there.
Well, what's neat though is when you go inside, they have the outline of the airplane on the ground.
Okay. Right.
To show you how much of the space it actually would fill up in real life.
Reginald asked, how much does it cost to go to these Japanese museums on the average?
It depends. Some of them, as I mentioned, are free. The ones that aren't, you're looking at no more than 500 yen, sometimes 100 or 200 yen. They're not particularly expensive. Not that I can think of. I think, the last one I went to was, Hiyauri, they did a big renovation when they put literally everything bilingual, and they bumped their ticket price up to like 420 yen, which is like about $4. And that seems to be about average, I think. I'm going off of memory because some of these places have been a while since I've been to.
Okay. William asks, in Nagasaki, are there any remnants of the A-bomb attack?
Yes. If I had more time, I would have gone into it. As I mentioned, there's two schools. There is in Hiroshima, there's one called Shiroyama in Nagasaki that survived the atomic bomb attack, and it's within half a kilometer of the atomic bomb site as well. When I went there, they're very nice people. The docent there speaks a little English, and he said that we were the first Americans he'd seen. And he's like, he was curious if they had like, do you not come down here to see atomic bomb sites? I said, well, no, Americans come down here all the time to see atomic bomb sites, but for some reason, I guess they're just slightly off the beaten path enough that it's not a direct long. Look, it's okay. Let me explain the atomic bomb sites in Nagasaki. You have the Peace Park, you have the hypocenter, and you have the museum. It's like it's like bang, bang, bang. You hit these three sites. But you go to the center site and you veer off this way, and that's the school. And so if you're following a set course, it's not convenient. So I made a point after visiting there to go write about it and try to encourage people to go out and see this, because it's a great place, again, to see history where it happened. Same story. School was used until the 80s, and then they tore down most of it, replaced the modern school. They left a big chunk, except theirs is vertical, to see a piece of real history where it was. Mm-hmm. And there's also a couple of, this is another piece for those of you who go down there. There's two shelters. Okay, one is easy to get to. So if you're visiting the Peace Park and you go up the stairs to get to the Peace Park, look to your right. There's a stone memorial thing. It's like a sign, like a sign, sorry. And look immediately behind it. There's a hole in the side of the hill, and these are air raid shelters. And they actually had survivors. People who were like less than 100 meters away from the atomic bomb in these shelters survived, which it's important to mention because they had a earlier air raid warning that morning. I believe the reconnaissance aircraft went overhead. So when the actual bombing happened, not everyone paid it heed, I believe. I'm just going off of memory, so I may be slightly off. And so not as many people took shelter as probably would have if they had not had that earlier air raid warning go off. Also, behind the History Museum in Nagasaki, the City History Museum, there is the Tategame air raid shelters and headquarters. This is where the government officials were on the morning of the bombing. In fact, on that morning, I read about how they have it in one of their pamphlets. The mayor of Sasebo went to this shelter to visit to take part in a meeting with all these the Nagasaki prefectural, the city mayors, to talk about what happened in Hiroshima and what will we do if it happens in Nagasaki. As they're having this meeting, the lights go out. And they didn't have to wait long to find out what would happen, unfortunately.
Okay. We probably have a couple more minutes for a couple more questions. This one is from Willard. Are there any museums that are similar to the National Museum of the Pacific War that you can visit to see preserved aircraft, military, or naval artifacts?
No, yes. So nothing as broad in scope as the Pacific War. But if you go to, there are a couple museums that focus on parts of it. Like Sasebo has the Sail Tower Museum, which is about the Japanese Navy history in Sasebo from beginning to the JMSDF today. And in Kure, which is one of the other Navy towns that I mentioned, along with Sasebo and the Shinjuku, they have a big museum, the Yamato Museum, because they have a model of the Yamato battleship the size of a real-life PT boat. It's 88 feet long, that covers the history of the Imperial Japanese Navy in Kure from, again, beginning to end. And their focus is, they tell a very just straightforward story. Again, they're not jingoistic or anything. They don't like brag on the war. It's not like, look at how great this was. It's more just this is the story of our people and what they did. And this is their part in this world event. And that museum actually has they have battleship parts from Mutsu. I actually did a whole article about how battleship Mutsu parts are all over the country. And they have a room full of kamikazes. They have the little submarines, not the midget subs at Pearl Harbor, but the ones that could fire, slightly bigger types. And they had a chitin, and they had a late model Zero, like A6M7 model 64. Sorry, that's 4 a.m. I'm going off memory, but that's a good one to see aircraft at if you want to see, and just see an all-around good collection. And also Kure, because it's a Navy site, it has ruins all over the place, and it has they have the old commander's house that's been preserved, and bunkers, and all sorts of stuff. So look up Kure, Kure. It's also near Hiroshima. So you go to Hiroshima, take a 45-minute train ride away, and you are in Kure. So I hope that's about the closest I can think that's similar to what you do. But they don't have anything as big in scope. They don't have like a national museum that recognizes the war. There's the Yasukuni Shrine, which has the Yushikan, which is a museum that does that, but nothing I think quite like you guys do.
Okay.
Though, yeah, there is the Yushikan. They do talk about the war there. That's more just the history of the imperial Japanese military from the era of the Shogun to 1945.
Okay. So this is all great information. So we have a couple of people asking about how do they contact you, or where can they contact you? Do you give tours?
Okay.
What's the best way to reach you?
I have a website called Wayfarer Daves, and I can be reached through there if you have any questions. I also have a Facebook, so you can message my Facebook on, not my personal one, please don't do that. But Wayfarer Daves is on Facebook, and you can message Wayfarer Daves. I do check messages there. So Wayfarer Daves on Facebook, or you can leave comments in the articles that I write on my website, Wayfarer Daves, and that's WAYFARERDAVES.com. I think I spelled Wayfarer Daves right.
Yes.
My computer's over here. That's why I keep looking over there. But yeah, the best way probably just be to message the Wayfarer Daves Facebook page. Or yes.
So that is all the time we have for our questions. So thank you again, David, for taking the time and telling us all about these historic sites and battlefields. And we hope one day we'll all get the chance to come over and visit those as well.
I hope so too.
Thank you to everyone for your ongoing support of the museum and our programs. We hope you have a great rest of your afternoon.
Soy Ginta.